We often describe a craving as if it were a high-stakes choice, a conscious, albeit difficult, desire for one thing over another. We treat it like a preference that has simply grown too loud to ignore. Neurologically, that surge represents the brain's anticipatory response to a learned reward. It is a signal that the thing that used to feel good is available, and the brain remembers exactly how to get it. This process happens in the basal ganglia, a set of structures deep in the brain that store habitual behaviors as automated sequences. Once a habit is established through repetition, the basal ganglia can initiate that sequence with almost no input from the rest of the brain. Compare that to the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, reasoning, and deliberate decision-making. While the basal ganglia is fast and automated, the cortex is slow, effortful, and requires conscious attention to function. This creates a structural mismatch. When a craving hits, a fast-acting biological automation is already running. Attempting to stop it with willpower alone forces the slow, deliberate tools of the cortex to fight a system specifically designed to operate without waiting for a conscious decision. Understanding this neurological reality changes how we view the experience. A craving is a stored neurological pattern being activated by a cue. Because it originates in a system that bypasses conscious thought, having a craving is not a moral verdict or a sign of a failed recovery. It is a predictable biological event. If willpower cannot stop the automation once it starts, the strategy must shift. Managing cravings requires us to map and re-engineer the system itself. This systemic approach is based on habit formation research from MIT, which identifies the specific framework the brain uses to build these automated loops. Every habit consists of 4 sequential components: the cue that triggers the brain, the craving or anticipation that follows, the routine of the behavior itself, and the reward that reinforces the entire cycle. Intervention starts at the very beginning of the loop. Research identifies 5 primary categories that account for almost every habit trigger: location, time of day, your emotional state, the people around you, and the preceding action. For those in transportation, these cues are often tied to the job. A specific highway exit or a particular truck stop associated with past use can function as a location cue, triggering the basal ganglia the moment you drive past. Similarly, finishing a long, high-stress delivery shift acts as a powerful behavioral anchor. The time of day and the act of clocking out signal to the brain that the old routine is about to begin. You cannot intercept a neurological loop that you don't see coming. Mapping these personal cues is the first mandatory step in shifting from a reactive struggle to a proactive strategy. Occupational stressors like irregular sleep and isolation create windows where the prefrontal cortex is at its weakest, making the automated loops of the basal ganglia much harder to interrupt. Clinicians use the acronym HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, to identify these moments of high vulnerability. When you are in one or more of these states, your biological capacity for deliberate control is at its absolute lowest. Using HALT as a self-check turns an overwhelming urge into a diagnostic step. If you recognize you are exhausted or lonely, you can address that specific physical or emotional need directly, rather than simply trying to white-knuckle through the craving. Beyond managing vulnerability, long-term recovery relies on what researcher Charles Duhigg calls the golden rule of habit change. The brain does not simply forget a trigger or the reward it delivers. Because those 2 elements are essentially permanent, the golden rule states that we must keep the cue and the reward in place, but substitute a different routine in the middle. This substitution requires planning. The new routine, whether it's a specific call, a transition ritual, or exercise, must be identified during a calm moment when the prefrontal cortex is fully available to do the work of preparation. Having that replacement routine ready before the trigger fires transforms a moment of crisis into a structured, actionable defense. Sometimes a trigger hits unexpectedly and no replacement routine is ready. In these moments, the craving loop initiates with its full intensity. For these acute situations, the most effective evidence-based response is a mindfulness technique called urge surfing. While a craving feels permanent, it is actually a biological wave. It rises, peaks, and naturally subsides within 30 minutes without requiring action. Urge surfing involves observing these physical sensations as they peak, witnessing the craving without engaging, arguing, or feeding it. Fighting the craving drains the cortex, while giving in reinforces the basal ganglia. Simply witnessing the wave allows the neurological pattern to pass through the system without being reinforced. By identifying our triggers, substituting our routines, and surfing unavoidable urges, we stop relying on a finite supply of willpower. We move past the struggle of the mismatch, and we can successfully reclaim control from our automated brain.